Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Today I would like to discuss a wonderful book, a memoir by an American pianist. So it's a musical memoir, but it's also an American memoir. It was written, it was published in 1881. The name of this memoir is Notes of a Pianist, and it's by the virtuoso pianist Louis Moreau Gottschalk. Now, Gottschalk was born in 1829 in New Orleans, in America, and he died 40 years later in 1869 in Brazil. And the book was only published in 1881 originally by his sister, and we'll come back to that in a minute. Now, Gottschalk didn't grow up, or he did grow up in America, in New Orleans, but very quickly in his teens, he left to go and study piano in Paris, in France, at the Conservatory of Music. And he stayed in Europe for about 10 years, a little bit at 10 years, touring in Germany, Switzerland, and France, Spain. And he never really established himself completely. He was quite well known, but at some stage he decided to go back to America and go back to his roots, as it were, and try to make a career there. So Notes of the Pianist is an absolutely wonderful memoir. It's very lively, very well written. The style is really, really great. It's observant, reflective, but not boringly so, descriptive, but not boringly so. He has loads of anecdotes and loads of things to tell us about his country that he's discovering in a way at that time. Those are wonderful reasons, and I would like to come back to some of them in 4 different points to try and convince you that Memoirs of a Notes of a Pianist is a really wonderful book to read. So we'll do that in 4 little parts. The first one will be about the relationship between memoirs or narratives of the self, like autobiographies, the relationship between those types of texts and truth, and what we mean by truth and what we want by truth in those types of text. What do we want to know? That will bring us to a second point, which is really, the broader question of why do we read those texts? Beyond perhaps the illusion of knowing something about somebody, is there something else we expect from them and we can get from them? The third point will be slightly different. That will be trying to place Gottschalk's endeavors as a pianist and a composer in his time, and especially in America. And so we'll talk a little bit about how America was perceived by the artists visiting it or emigrating there. And finally, that will bring us to Gottschalk's identity as an American composer, as opposed to a composer. So let's get started with the relationship between memoirs and truth in general. Now, it's important, of course, when we read those texts, autobiographies, memoirs, diaries, correspondences even, it's always, of course, the first question to ask is, who put those texts together, when, and in what way? There is a wonderful book on the subject by Ian Hamilton, The Keepers of the Flame, or the Keepers of the Flame, I think. A wonderful book about how inheritors of literary estates, that is, those people who basically inherited manuscripts or complete works sometimes from their parents or their brothers, whatever, how those inheritors handled the publication of those texts. And here we have a case in point. Gottschalk himself never wrote a complete autobiography, never wrote complete memoirs. He did set out to write about his own life, let's say, so you could say that he started on writing an autobiography, but really it was very fragmentary. On the other hand, he did write for magazines, French magazines, English and American magazines, and newspapers as well. And so, in that sense, what happened is that his sister, who lived in Paris at the time, collected that material and organized that material in the book that we read today. Now, you might say that this could be problematic because now we don't really know what exactly Gottschalk himself wrote, let's say, for publication, let's say personal publication, and what he wrote for newspapers and magazines. And of course, those texts, when you write for those publications, have a very different type of essence to them. Writing for a large audience magazine is not the same as writing one's autobiography necessarily in terms of intentions and in terms of style and in terms of what one talks about. And here we have what Hamilton, in his wonderful book, clearly shows is that throughout the centuries, inheritors make choices based on their own interests. And those need not be financial necessarily. Those are very often to do with reputation as well. And that seems to have been the case here, is that Gottschalk's sister, who depended heavily on him for her own survival in Paris, she had a son at the time. Well, Gottschalk there had been rumors of Gottschalk's romantic involvement with different women. And he had to leave America in a sort of a hurry, go on tour in South America in his 20s, at the end of his 20s, because of such rumors, which in fact still today we don't quite know whether they were true or not, that is, whether it really happened or not. Nevertheless, his sister seems to have made a selection and an organization of the work that we can read today as Notes of a Pianist, also taking into account our own reputation and reputation of her family's name. And so this places us in the usual situation when we read works like this of asking ourselves, okay, what is it that we do know? What is it that we can know? And what should I do with what I am told? There's a classic example of that type of situation with Siegfried Sassoon, of course, his famous, the First World War poet, his famous trilogy, Memoirs of an Infantry Officer is the first volume, I think, or Fox Hunting Man. I can't remember which one is the first one. Wonderful, wonderful trilogy, exquisitely written and smart and funny and deep, and it's wonderful books to read. But yeah, Sassoon is outwardly talking about writing his own memoir, writing about his time before the war, during the war, after the war. But in fact, he took out a whole lot of things about himself. In fact, the trilogy starts with him living with his aunts because his parents are dead, whereas in real life, Sassoon's parents were not dead at all. This is a typical situation that we have with Gottschalk here, is that there are many things that he doesn't say about himself, and whether he doesn't say them because he didn't want to say them, or whether his sister decided not to let him say it in a posthumous publication like this, is something that we cannot know. If you are interested in those questions, of course, there are some very, I can recommend, of course, Clive James' Unreliable Memoirs, which are very, very funny, where he starts openly. In fact, the name says it all, Unreliable Memoirs. So I'm going to tell you some things, and some of them are true and some of them are not true. Some of the names are true and some of the names are not true. And you'll constantly have to navigate between, what is outwardly the truth, the reality of what happened, based on the memories of somebody, and the reality of the situation at that time. Hermione Lee, the English essayist and writer, wrote a wonderful little book called Virginia Woolf's Nose on those problems. Richard Holmes, the historian, Sidetracks, wonderful book as well. Exactly on those situations, and ultimately the question being an ontological one, really, which is, can we ever know anybody, whichever the source of the information that we have about that somebody? So that brings us, of course, to the second part of this, which is, if we can be sure that those things happened, why do we read those things then? Or is it like fiction? Do we read it for entertainment? Well, not really. Typically, we read those works autobiographies, memoirs, for three reasons. We want to know about the writer themselves, perhaps. We want to know how it was at the time, and we want to have details about that time, not only in terms of objects and things they did, but how they thought, perhaps, or how they viewed the world. And it might be all three at once. It might be just only one of them, but surely one of the three will apply. So that's what we want to discuss now. And here, Gottschalk is a perfect illustration of those three ways of approaching, or three benefits from those narratives of the self, whichever form they take. Because first of all, he tells us an enormous lot about America in 1850, 45, 50, 55, 60. Not only about what it looked like, we've got loads of text, of course, about all this, but also about how people simply experienced life, not only in the big cities, and not only in the woods somewhere, but in a sort of, heartland of America type of towns. He travels a lot because he's a concert pianist. That's how he makes his living, primarily by touring the country, giving concerts. So by touring the country, and by necessity really, because he needs to earn money, so he needs to play for audiences, he has to range far and wide. He's based in New York in the beginning. He has to range far and wide in America to find places to play. And so, yes, you can go and give, he does, of course, give concerts all the way at the top of America, going into Canada, so Boston, Toronto, New York, of course, Philadelphia. But he also has to range much further. He goes down to the south, he goes in the middle, Midwest. And of course, we remember that at that time, America was only growing, but it had by no means attained the sort of complete homogeneity that it has today. And by homogeneity, of course, I only mean the fact that there are large cities in the heart of America, and not only the coast are heavily populated and the like. So we get an idea about all this, and he sees himself and talks about not only the way cities or towns differ in terms of how they look. That's not necessarily what he's talking about very much, but much more how the people themselves are in those cities. What is their attitude towards strangers, that is people from outside? What is their attitude towards New York, for example, the arts, culture, music, musicians? He doesn't always appreciate the way he's being treated, and like he's a virtuoso. He's again conservatively trained, recognized as a classical pianist of extreme talent. So of course he has also a slight ego, but he doesn't really have a much ego, and that's the wonderful thing about this book. Is that, and that's the second aspect that we very often look for in those autobiographies, is of course, what do we know about him? Now, I didn't know anything about Gottschalk when I found the book. I had never heard of his name. And so I wasn't necessarily interested in him as a person, because I didn't know him and I had nothing to look forward to. But it turns out to be an extremely sensitive, observant, funny, eager to understand and learn type of person. Wherever he goes, he looks around because he wants to know what it is like, how people are. He traveled extensively, the last 10 years of his life, he traveled extensively in South America, West Indies, so stayed a long time away from America, hardly ever came back, in fact. And everywhere he went, he had the same curiosity, the same desire to know and hear and taste and feel things. And so he was a romantic pianist really by trade, or by sentiment perhaps. Nevertheless, he was always open for everything. And so, even though we didn't know him in the beginning, I didn't know him in the beginning, as you go along, you discover a person as well, and not simply a describer of things, or not somebody who talks about himself or what he likes. No, somebody who really engages with the whole society around him. And that society, again, I remind you, let me go back to that point very, very briefly, is also a very interesting time in American history, of course, because he lives through the Civil War, for example. So he has some harrowing pages on the trains full of coffins, for example, during the Civil War. He's also there hearing the news on his way to California about the American President Lincoln, of course, being assassinated. He tells us about that. He tells us about seeing the assassin, Booth, I think, seeing him on the stage because the assassin, the Booth guy, was an actor, a kind of failed actor. Gottschalk had seen him on stage in New York like 2 or 3 years before. He remembers that. And he tells us about the people on the boat, just normal people, and how they feel about how they receive the news, this shattering news, of course, of Lincoln being assassinated. And within that society, that's a third aspect of reading autobiographies and memoirs like this, and in particular this one, of course, what we do get is also an idea about the state of music and musicians in America at the time. Now, America at the time had seen a lot of immigration of European musicians, conductors, loads of Germans, loads of Italians, some French, of course, some English, Swedish, Jenny Lind. And those had really arrived with, of course, a very strong education in classical tradition, which obviously, by definition, being from Europe, was an import or an export towards America. And so when Gottschalk himself came back to America, he had in fact to compete with an awful lot of very famous musicians. So typically singing and piano, not only, of course, but typically. It was the time of the creation of large orchestras in America, but those were still very few and far between. And of course, because there was no other means to listen or to hear music than to go to the concerts, it meant also that concert halls, by definition, were the place to hear music, at home to play it, but that didn't apply to everyone, of course. Now, what was the life of a classical musician at the time? Well, for somebody like Gottschalk, making his money by touring the country, it meant, just like it means today, really, finding engagements, making sure that you have enough dates on the tour to get some money out of it, hoping that your agent, which you will be unlucky with, hoping that your agent will not swindle you out of a whole lot of money or will be good enough to organize a series of concerts, finding musicians to play with on the tour, perhaps. Now, very often Gottschalk travels on his own and plays with local musicians, a singer, a violinist, a cellist, for example. And he himself travels with his pianos on the train. That's where you, for example, hear that when he has to go up towards Canada, I think, it's like 14-hour long train journey. There's no heating on the train, and he's there with his two pianos and his piano tuner, who always traveled with him. But by the same token, of course, you do find out a lot about how those musicians survived, and that was not easy at all. Why? Simply because it was a highly competitive world, and that for every new young thing, like Gottschalk himself was when he came back to America, he was feted. There was enormous receptions for him and great concerts organized. It was major news. But yeah, 2 years later, there was another guy coming from Europe who was just as good. And then 2 years later, there was another one. And then 2 years later, another one. And of course, this constant competition between musicians meant also that it was more difficult to get concerts, more difficult to get big concert halls, therefore more difficult to make money. So you had to find other revenue streams. So, for example, teaching, in the case of Gottschalk, a little bit in New York, not that much, but a little bit. And also publishing his music, writing his music down on sheet music and selling it. And if you are interested in those things, I talk quite a bit about that in another video on the wonderful book, Men, Women and Pianos by Arthur Loesser. Because piano, the 19th century is the century of the piano, and it was a necessity, in fact, for different reasons, to have sheet music published. And many of those musicians saw an opportunity here to, by simplifying their music and writing it down for beginners, for example, or intermediate players, to make additional money, of course. And Gottschalk certainly did that because, for a while, he was immensely famous, and some of his songs and compositions were played absolutely everywhere all over America, and were sold in great quantities. So bad traveling conditions, poor revenues, difficulties of finding a place to stay, and money to make. All those aspects are also part of that wonderful memoir. And that is certainly one of the reasons as well. We read those works, we want to know how it was for him or for her then, there, and what we can not only learn about that person, but their surroundings, their context, their mentality, and their visions of things in general. And here Gottschalk, of course, mixes a heavily idiosyncratic identity, really, born and raised in New Orleans, emigrated to Europe, lived there for just as long as he had lived in New Orleans, and then coming back, and certainly for him, America was new. He didn't know, he had never traveled through America before, so he was discovering his own country, and therefore he was discovering his own countrymen and countrywomen. And that is also that journey, that exploration of his own people and his own identity, therefore, which is wonderful in that book to discover as we go along. And that is the third point, is America then, how was it perceived? How was it seen from outsiders? Now, of course, it would be very stupid of me to generalize and to say, this was the way it was done. So I will only refer to a couple of things, of course. And I only want to talk about art, that is the relationship, how those foreigners, those Europeans typically, so America's relationship with, here in that case, of course, classical music, and let's say the traditional classical arts, ballet, etc. Again, it's good to remind ourselves that Gottschalk was partly an outsider. He was raised speaking French, and then, of course, all those years in Paris, where he had no reason to speak English, for example. So when he came back also, Gottschalk was again an outsider, because he had, before he sailed back from Paris to New York, not Paris, to New York, he had never been to New York. He had certainly never been to Boston or Philadelphia. He had never been in the Midlands or in the heart of America. And so all this for him was completely new as some of those visitors who came from Europe and discovered America as they went along. Now, at the same time as, a few years after his death, really, a famous kind of book at the time that made big noise in America was published by Fanny Trollope, and Fanny Trollope was the mother of the famous English writer Trollope. His first name escapes me now, of course. Anthony Trollope, of course. Very productive 19th century writer, 20th century. And so anyway, Fanny Trollope, for various reasons, really mostly because her husband squandered all their money, so she was looking for funds to basically be able to live. She emigrated to America for about 4 or 5 years, trying to find partnerships there and businesses to establish, perhaps. And so she traveled extensively in America at a very slow pace, typically, staying in some different places for a few weeks or a few months even. And taking houses there, so not simply visiting, staying at a hotel, moving after 2 days, but really, renting a house for 6 months, for example. Now, that book made a big splash when it came out. Scandal would be perhaps too strong, but created a lot of resentment in America, because Fanny Trollope was basically saying the Americans have no culture. And by culture, she means artistic culture, aesthetic culture, intellectual culture. She said, no, the Americans have none of that. They only care about money and religion. The country at the time was indeed heavily influenced, of course, by Christian religion. And that's what strikes Fanny Trollope immediately when she comes to those small towns sometimes, and even mid-towns, which is the ever-presence of religion, and she was religious herself, of course, and she was a believer, but she was a high church believer, and she didn't think that the emphasis on religion should be the way it was at the time in America. So, but what she was especially, let's say, remarking on was the effect of religious morals on artistic culture and creation. And for example, she visits many places where putting a play on stage is simply forbidden. Types of music are forbidden. So there are no bookshops, there are no theaters, there are no cultural places. And that's something that Gottschalk sees and hears very quickly when he starts traveling outside of New York and the big musical centers like Boston, for example, is that, as he remarks somewhere in that book, of course, people hardly make the difference between Mozart and a song created to be whistled, as a nothing tune. In fact, what he very often complains about, or sometimes complains about, is the fact that typically those audiences will actually prefer the song, the nothing song, and will get quickly bored by a Mozart or Beethoven sonata, for example. And we have to remember here, Gottschalk was a virtuoso, a recognized great talent. He cared deeply about music. He cared deeply about the beauty and the expressiveness of music. For him, art meant something. He refers very often to writers and painters. Art meant something morally, intellectually, psychologically, culturally. It was important. And what he sees very quickly is that this is not so. And that is what Fanny Trollope insists on time and again, to the great pain, of course, of Americans at the time, is that there is none of that in America. The only obsession is money. Well, money, religion. And that, of course, is reflected in what people want to hear from Gottschalk, for example. And you will be perhaps surprised to read in that book that typically his concert had to be, well, of course, they are thought through beforehand. You just don't come and do anything. But he knew that he couldn't have a whole evening of Mozart, Beethoven, and Chopin. That was just not possible. People would be bored too much. People wanted to hear also stuff they recognized, so it had to be that kind of music. And also, very quickly, his manager realized that what people were really eager for him to do was to improvise. He was well known for being very good at improvising on the spot. So his manager would go around the concert hall with a hat, and people would put in suggestions of pieces of music, well-known pieces of popular music. And then Gottschalk would choose a few, and he would improvise on the theme immediately, and that really impressed people. It's also good to remind ourselves here that one could achieve great fame already at the time in America by being a musician. Gottschalk had this thing when he came on stage. He wore gloves always, and then he would delicately take the gloves one finger at a time, put them on the piano, and then start playing. At the end of the concerts, women would rush to the stage to try and grab the gloves, and the gloves would be cut up in little bits and to be given to women who kept them preciously. His main fans, his main groups of fans were easily recognizable because they had to wear rose, the color rose, which I think is well known these days in music as well. So this is America for somebody like Gottschalk, for somebody like Fanny Trollope, for Max Marecek, very famous at the time, impresario and musician, setting up concerts and being an agent for. They all remark on the same thing: is that the only thing that matters is the dollar, the money. Art is simply, it could be chairs, it could be sand, it could be anything. It doesn't matter what it is. What matters is how much money you can make from it. And you see here something that will be, of course, picked up on by the Europeans moving in the 20th century, for example, just before the Second World War, typically, that this sort of discrepancy between the two worlds, in that sense, one in which all that music meant so much culturally, historically, and therefore, Europe, of course, and therefore invested themselves in a way in that music in a way that the Americans, a nascent country trying to build itself and concerned with very different things, that country was not prepared or was not necessarily interested to invest itself in culture and in the art in the same way as those Europeans did. So that brings us to the fourth point, which is really interesting when we think about Gottschalk, and that is his place today. And now, Frederick Starr, a well-known writer on music, American music, wrote a massive biography, too massive, I think, on Gottschalk. And his main argument is basically, well, look, Gottschalk is the first American composer. Now, of course, I have none of the expertise of Frederick Starr to judge this at all. His main point really being that what Gottschalk started doing is mixing a sort of popular request from people, that is what he could see people loved hearing. His classical training and his virtuosic to a degree, you have to go on YouTube and listen to it, you'll see. And his origins, New Orleans origin. Now, New Orleans is very famous for being the birthplace of jazz, and jazz is a syncopated music, whereas, of course, classical music, typically certainly at that time, was a very regular music. By bringing elements of European classical music, New Orleans and all the mixed and black population in New Orleans at the time, and the French influences at the time, and the sort of popular taste, Gottschalk managed to compose pieces that sold by the million, literally, when he published them in sheet music. Everyone was playing Gottschalk. Those pieces were extremely well known at the time. For the biographer, that is what is interesting mostly about Gottschalk, is that he's not simply a pianist. There were many of them. A virtuoso, there were many of them. His compositions have, it's fair to say, largely disappeared. But we can think about him as the beginning of a cultural identity in America, perhaps, by mixing different elements of typical American traits with, of course, a European background. By mixing those traits, Gottschalk, his biographer argues, created something new. And by creating something new, that new music, that new integration of different origins, we go, of course, to the melting pot sort of idea about America, which is, this is American music. American music is not one thing. American music is the result of many different influences, some of them from down south, some of them from abroad, because that's where we come from ultimately, some of them from the psyche, the mentality, the nature of what it is to be an American. Gottschalk was an American, he was proud to be an American, but he was also the product of so much more than just one place in America. He was the product, again, of New Orleans, Europe, and he's touring and engaging with everyday Americans around the country. So, in conclusion, what can we say? Notes of a Pianist is an absolutely wonderful read. Very well written, again, very funny, harrowing at times. He really had a style. And as I said in the beginning, because some of those bits some bits in the book were written for magazines, it's also polished. I mean, it's not written, hastily. Or we talked about the disadvantages of such a redacted, as it were, or posthumously edited work, but at the same time, we benefit from the wonderful, wonderful style and mind of Gottschalk. Even if you have no interest in 19th century America or music or piano or 19th century piano classical music in America, it doesn't matter. It could be something else. It just happens to be a point of confluence between ideas about identities in general, musical world, the growth of America at the time, turbulent times as well. So the creation of the America that we know today, really, in many ways, all through wonderful anecdotes and a great mind at work, a curious mind, an engaged mind. So for all those reasons, I can only encourage you, of course, to go to your local bookshop Order that wonderful book, lie in the sun, read away, and you won't regret it. Thank you.